Alright, geranium. It's all about geranium today. Who's a fan of this aromatic, spicy note? If you're a fan, you're going to want to find out the fragrances I'm going to speak to you about today and a little bit about what geranium is. So if you're curious, then please stay tuned. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Sebastian with Smelling Great Fragrance Reviews. Yes, today it's all about geranium, a note that I've loved for quite some time. The very first time I heard about geranium in a fragrance was a fragrance called Salvatore Ferragamo Pour Homme, a fragrance I bought in the late 90s. I wore it, but realized later it was a combination of fig and geranium, fig leaves. So ever since then I've really studied some notes in perfumes and figured out where geranium is used. But today, when I speak to you about these fragrances, you're going to find out and figure out where this particular note is used quite a bit. So, as I said, it's all about geranium in fragrances today, and I've got 11 fragrances that feature this note that I'm going to discuss with you today. But before I get to all the info, if this is your first time tuning into the channel and you still haven't subscribed, please do click the subscribe button below and also click the bell so you'll be notified for future videos and giveaways. So what is geranium? Geranium is a shrub that I remember growing up when I was a little kid that my parents had growing in the garden. It's a kind of a very fragrant smell, but to me the smell came from the leaves. I loved picking these leaves and smelling them. To me, it's almost like a very kind of rosy, minty, herbal kind of a smell to me. It had rosy nuances, but it didn't feel or smell like the actual big, juicy roses that you would smell off of a rose, but it had those kind of more masculine, aromatic, and minty rose smells. So this is basically the geranium note, and it's used a lot in perfumery. And what they do is they steam distill the leaves and then they create the geranium oil. And of course, it's also used with some health reasons too. I was noticing that people have some uses for them. If you're curious, look up what it's used for. But there's geranium, there's pelargonium, and then there's also rose geranium. And there's it's all the same flower pretty much, or the plant pretty much. But in general, the geranium is very green and grassy, very minty, herbal, aromatic. But as I said, it has those rosy nuances. But sometimes I get a little bit of a citronella-like quality in there as well. Slightly, very, very slightly lemony tinge to that particular, plant or herb or whatever. So one fragrance I'm not going to talk to you about today is Frédéric Malle's Geranium Pour Monsieur. For me, that fragrance goes to minty toothpaste. It's mostly about geranium and mint, but the mint they're using in that fragrance is a bit not my favorite. So I won't be discussing that fragrance today, and I also won't be discussing the Salvatore Ferragamo Pour Homme fragrance I mentioned to you. But I don't currently own a bottle. I know a friend has a bottle, but I don't have it here with me. But if you are a fan of that fragrance, take out the fragrance and start smelling it and see what it's all about. One thing I did forget about the smell of the geranium, that does have a lot of black peppery spiciness as well. That's definitely there. When you smell it, you not only get the greenness, the aromatic mintiness, the rosy nuances, but there's a spicy black peppery touch to it as well. It's not the kind of black pepper that makes you sneeze, but in there you can pick up the spiciness. So let's get started with the fragrances. The first fragrance I'm going to talk to you about is from the house of Chanel, and this is a fragrance I featured over the weekend in my top 30 classic fragrances video. If you haven't caught that, please do. This is Platinum Egoiste. Here is a very, very aromatic metallic fragrance for me, and this is one thing that geranium does for me. Geranium, along with other herbal notes, and sometimes when you add certain notes to it like citruses, kind of goes screechy metallic. Here it's definitely doing that for me a lot. But this one has loads of lavender, herb, it's aromatic, geranium, herb, it's aromatic, rosemary, herb, it's aromatic, but you also have tons of clary sage, more herb, aromatic sage, and then throw in some oak moss, some petitgrain, it's bitter green citrus, galbanum, vetiver. It's a very, very aromatic and woody, spicy experience. Very, very big on the geranium, very big on the mint. It doesn't quite stop in the barbershop-y section kind of department of fragrances, but maybe it does a little bit. For me, it's a completely different fragrance. It's very, very metallic and sharp smelling, and this is what happens with a lot of herbs when they're joined together, and then adding some additional notes, it can go quite screechy. So I'm recommending this as a geranium fragrance, but geranium is definitely not the main star of this fragrance. It's a supporter, but it blends very well with all the other herbal aromatic notes. And at one time I wore tons of this in the early 90s when it came out in 93, 94, 95. I got tired of it and I bought another bottle in the late 2000s. I wore that, kind of got tired of it, and I bought another bottle at the end of the 2010s, which is this right here. So I'm a little burnt out on it again. That happens with fragrances, but I like the smell. I like the whole metallic thing. Anyway, Platinum Egoiste is a great fragrance for you to try, to check into, in case you like, the herbal aromatic fragrances featuring herbs along with geranium. So this next one I recently featured in a fragrance video for two new clone-y kind of Banana Republic fragrances, and this one's called Grassland, which in this one I mentioned it was all about mint, but there is a very, very heavy geranium prominence in here as well. Lots of geranium. So it's mint, geranium, and lavender. These herbs really go wonderfully together, and they complement one another. Of course, as I said, geranium has these minty nuances. Here it's very, very minty, but I think the mint along with the geranium is giving us a little more of a minty boost kind of a thing. But definitely also aromatic. It's lots of aromatic touches. Lavender, it goes in a fougere direction, a minty fougere. I do have another minty fougere here that also uses geranium in the notes as well. Along with moss, which is oak moss, there's some ozonic touches here, patchouli, sandalwood apple. It does remind me a little bit of Creed's, well, actually, here's the thing. When I first smelled this right out of the bottle, it was really reminding me of Green Irish Tweed a lot. And even though I'm smelling Green Irish Tweed here, I'm picking up other minty fragrances as well. So it's almost like you've got the Green Irish Tweed thing happening. Maybe they used that as a inspiration, but they kind of like tweaked things and gave us something completely different. Because there is some metallic touches in here. It also reminds me a little bit of Platinum Egoiste, so it's got major influences. And even though I didn't read any ozonic notes in here, the metallic qualities of this fragrance has a very ozonic quality as well along with it, which I didn't mention. And here it does remind me a little bit of Platinum Egoiste later when I was testing this out, even after I did that video. So in the end, I find this a good fragrance. Even though it's a kind of clone-y fragrance, but I feel like it's not an ultra straightforward clone. It's an inspired fragrance more than a clone, and in the end it's using lots of mint with lots of geranium. It does, as I said, it does have those metallic qualities, and then later on it did start reminding me of the Platinum Egoiste, but again it's barbershop-y and things like that. So check this one out if you don't know it. It's Grassland from Banana Republic. It's definitely a quality fragrance. I'm really enjoying the Banana Republic fragrances, even though they're kind of clone-y a little bit. They're not original scents. They're more like inspired by other fragrances, which could be a bad thing and a good thing at the same time. So in this video, I'm not ranking the fragrances, but I'm starting out with fragrances that are not so geranium heavy, and the further to the top or the end of the video we get to, they're going to be more geranium fragrances than the star, or the main star of the fragrance. But the next fragrance I'm going to talk to you about today is a classic from the late 1800s, but it was redone in 2010, and it's a fougere. It's the very first fougere fragrance. It's Fougere Royale, and again, it's a fougere. Fougere fragrances have geranium, either a lot of geranium or a little bit of geranium, but they're definitely there to support the lavender and to add this like peppery spiciness, slightly rosy nuance to the fragrances. So definitely is pretty prominent here, but it's not the main star. The main star is the lavender along with the oak moss, but geranium is really, really close behind those two notes as well. You get a major prominent geranium note in here. In the end, it's very, very green. It's very herbal and aromatic, slightly minty nuances, of course. But this one actually also has a little bit of, I get a chamomile, like a tea kind of a vibe in here, which is kind of interesting with this fragrance. But lots of bergamot, vanilla, heliotrope. There is some carnation, clary sage, and musk as well. It's a great classy, masculine fougere fragrance, and you know, I think it's definitely worth a try if you haven't tried this one. Again, the star of the show is lavender. It's not geranium, but you can definitely pick up the geranium. In here, I don't get much rosy nuances of the geranium, but I get the peppery, minty nuances coming in with this fragrance. When we're talking about the geranium note. If you don't know this one, do check it out. I have tons of videos on this fragrance on the channel, so I think you're going to enjoy some of the videos and of course the fragrance itself. So that's Houbigan's Fougere Royale. Next is a fragrance from the house of Chanel. Again, Chanel. This is Boy. So this one is once again a very unisex fougere, and that's one thing I forgot to mention. When you're watching this video, you're going to realize that the fragrances that feature geranium are more on the masculine line or side of fragrances. That definitely is a masculine note. It appears in fougères a lot, even though this is a unisex targeted fragrance, and this is a unisex targeted fragrance as well. I feel like they lean definitely more on the masculine side. It's definitely a masculine note to me. It's a flower, but then it's an herbal flower, of course, and they don't distill or create the oil from the flowers. It's from the actual leaves anyway. But with Chanel Boy, it reminds me of another fragrance in here that has more geranium that I'm going to get to. It's probably one of the fragrances that's more geranium heavy. But here with this one, it's lots of lavender, but then it's got lots of white musk, and then we have geranium appear. So the geranium in here has the peppery qualities and the green herbal aromatic qualities for me in this one. But it's definitely a Chanel fragrance. You can totally pick up the Chanel DNA. That appears with heliotrope. It's powdery. There's some creamy, really, really cozy sandalwood and vanilla in here as well. Grapefruit and orange blossom. I've heard from men this is definitely feminine leaning, but for me, it's definitely unisex. It's a unisex fragrance. I don't find it very gender-sided. It's definitely right down the middle, but I feel like sometimes when people smell the fragrance and they've smelled a lot of like feminine Chanel fragrances, it'll probably remind them of the DNA, because I feel like there's a aldehydic DNA in here in Chanel Boy, which is totally obviously present in a lot of Chanel fragrances. So when you smell that, it might remind you of you know, the feminine Chanel fragrances featuring the aldehydes. But I smell that in here. It's almost like this aldehydic Chanel DNA. It doesn't have to be aldehydic either, but I associate aldehydes with Chanel fragrances, and it's definitely obvious that it's this Chanel. It smells like a Chanel fragrance. But it's a great aromatic fougere fragrance, and it features a very nicely green, peppery geranium note, along with lavender and white musk and heliotrope. So that is Boy from the house of Chanel. Next fragrance we're going to talk about is another minty fougere from the house of Diptyque. This is Eau de Minty. So here, what did we say? Geranium has minty qualities, so it complements the mint in here perfectly. It is a minty fougere fragrance. They're not using lavender in here at all. And according to their website, Diptyque's website, the mint comes from Oregon. It says Oregon mint, so I didn't realize that Oregon had a special mint, but I guess it does. But for me, this one, in the end, reminds me a little bit of Drakkar Noir. If you're a fan of Drakkar Noir and you want a more updated, a little more modern version of that fragrance, definitely check into this one, because I feel like it totally takes me back to the 80s when I wore like 4 or 5 bottles of what do you call it, the Drakkar Noir, and it just takes me down to memory lane of 80s when I was in high school. But in the end, it is a minty experience, and the geranium in here definitely complements and adds a peppery spice, a green peppery spice to the mint, where the mint didn't, for me in general, mint, I grew up eating mint. I love the taste of mint. To me, it doesn't have as much of a spice as like peppery spiciness of some other herbs or spices do. So it kind of not only like smells a little bit like mint to begin with, but it adds that kick of the spiciness to the fragrance itself, and it makes for a great wearing experience. But Diptyque's Eau de Minty has mint, geranium, patchouli, nutmeg, and rose. And for me, this particular fragrance, along with Tempo and then Eau Capitale, somehow feels like they're evolutions of one another. They're kind of green fragrances, tempo focusing on the patchouli with lots of green mate notes. This one, of course, green and fougere, barbershop-y experience with the geranium and the mint and patchouli. And then with Eau Capitale, again, it's the patchouli and the rose this time, kind of very green experiences. So the three fragrances that came one after another from Diptyque are really great fragrances. But the only thing about this one, it is a unisex targeted fragrance. Once again, it leans masculine, and I've heard from women they don't like it because it reminds them of their dad or grandfather when they were wearing, you know, the 80s, you know, fougere barbershop fragrances. That's the kind of a negative about it. But if you like the idea of a minty fougere barbershop fragrance with lots of spicy peppery geranium, then check out Eau de Minty from the house of Diptyque. The next fragrance we're talking about is Quadrifoglio, this one right here from the house of Bottega Veneta, which in this particular fragrance, the geranium is, again, a supporting player. But here, the main player is the basil note. There's lots of greenish notes in here to begin with. Lots of bergamot, and then, of course, the geranium. There's also grapefruit, incense, a little incense, not too much. Some coumarin, hedione, and ISOE super. But in the end, it's a very fresh and spicy aromatic fragrance. If you like green aromatic fragrances, lots of herbs, herbal fragrances, aromatic notes, of course, spicy and aromatic herbal touches, then you're going to really enjoy this one. It's a great herb garden come alive with citruses thrown in kind of a thing. Lots of woody touches as well. But in the end, the geranium in here gives it that greenish kind of minty pepperiness to the fragrance. And then the basil is a little more sweeter. It has a sweeter touches to begin with, along with the greenish notes and the bergamot here. I think it's a heavenly fragrance that I really enjoy. If you don't know this, definitely check it out. It's Quadrifoglio from the house of Bottega Veneta. A great house that not a lot of people talk about with this particular house. So the next fragrance we're going to head to is a fragrance from the house of Molton Brown, and this is Geranium Nefertum, this one right here. So finally we're getting into the fragrances that features geranium in the name, which means it's a main star or part of the main show. It's a main star, it's the main player. But with this particular fragrance, Geranium Nefertum, it's a nice fusion of geranium with fig leaf. So remember earlier on I told you that there was a fragrance that I bought in the late 90s called Salvatore Ferragamo pour Homme. That fragrance featured lots of geranium, the peppery kind, spicy kind with fig leaf. So for me, this is kind of similar idea, but it doesn't smell identical. So geranium, fig leaf kind of complement one another, I think. There's a spicy pepperiness about geranium as a note, and also there's a spicy pepperiness about fig leaves as well. There is that peppery touch, very green and woody as well, slightly bitter. So in here they complement each other really perfectly. And throw in some sandalwood in here as well. And it's a great aromatic, slightly minty, peppery experience. For me, I feel like the two notes, geranium and fig leaf, when they clashed, they produced more minty touches. Does that make sense? So it's a minty experience where they're not using the mint note, and there's a mintiness about it. So in the end, it doesn't really smell like the mint, especially the kind that I don't like, the toothpaste kind, but it's almost like a minty pepper kind of a smell, woody and aromatic and herbal and spicy. I really do like it, but it's not a very strong fragrance. It's definitely more of a, it's closer to the skin, but very fresh and refreshing and woodsy spicy. So that is Geranium Nefertum from the house of Molton Brown. The next fragrance we're going to is a fragrance from the house of Creed, and it's Vetiver Geranium. Vetiver Geranium, one of my favorite Creed fragrances. Look at this, it came off, that's kind of annoying. So Vetiver Geranium is one of my favorite Creed fragrances. I absolutely love this fragrance. It's a very masculine, but still unisex enough for a woman to pull off kind of a fragrance. Geranium itself is the prominent star in this fragrance, the main player, but it's nice balance with vetiver. And then there is green apple in here. Green apple comes in and adds this really sweet touch. Very balanced, the kind that's sweet but slightly tart, along with patchouli, musk, and lemon. I think this fragrance is very heavenly, very heavenly. The geranium in here is the peppery kind with slight rosy nuances under there. The vetiver in here is the earthy kind, a little damp kind of you know, a little bit, you know, green and earthy woody, along with that green apple. I think these three notes are what's really driving this fragrance. Well, I think the patchouli is pretty prominent as well, but really one of the best fragrances from Creed, hands down, and it smells so good on me. It's just a great, great balanced combination of geranium, vetiver, green apple. It's that green apple that throws in that weird twist that's really, really delicious in the end, and it really, really complements the vetiver geranium really, really wonderfully. If you don't know this one, you've got to get your nose on it. It's a great, great geranium vetiver fragrance from the House of Creed. So that's geranium vetiver from, so that's vetiver geranium from the House of Creed. I get mixed up because for me I get more geranium with that one, and I want to say geranium vetiver, but it's actually called vetiver geranium. It sounds better that way. The reason I want to call it geranium vetiver is because, as I said, I do get more geranium in that fragrance, and typically when the prominent note in a fragrance is, you know, the geranium, they usually call it geranium vetiver, but they've named it vetiver geranium, which generally means you get more vetiver and geranium. But anyway, those are my little quirks. Next fragrance, we're going to the House of Frederic Malle. This is Rose and CUIR. So here's an interesting fragrance that actually is focusing on geranium once again, but it's geranium with its most rosy nuances, and probably they're using rose geranium in here. According to my research, this is the kind of geranium they distill to make the geranium oil. But it's the rosier kind of geranium, and typically a lot of perfumery lies to us since they call it something that it's not really what they use to create the fragrance. So it's basically almost like an accord. But with this one, lots of geranium, lots of leather, vetiver, black currant, cedar, and Timut pepper. But it's a very, very grassy green experience here. The geranium not only has its rosy nuances, but minty touches as well. There's a minty, grassy quality in this one, and it's a nice contrast, an awesome contrast from the leather in this fragrance. So this was not a love at first sniff. It was kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit, but it grew on me a lot because I love minty. You know, I like the mintiness of the geranium, and I love rosy fragrances anyway, but that to trick us to thinking that we're smelling rose from geranium is kind of an amazing thing to me, and they totally do accomplish it with this particular fragrance from the House of Frederic Malle. This is created by Jean-Claude Helena. I think he's a master perfumer, and he's done a great job here, even though I thought it was not a great fragrance at first, later grew on me. So that's Rose and CUIR from the House of Frederic Malle. So the next fragrance we're going to talk about is from the House of Hermes. Hermes, it's Equipage Geranium. Oh man, this is so good. This is so, so good. It's a peppery geranium, and this is the one that kind of reminds me of Boy from Chanel, but here lots more geranium in this one, lots more geranium. It's a combination of geranium, spices, and sandalwood, and it's very, very heavenly. It's just, I love the whole spiciness of the geranium in here. It does have the mintiness for sure. There are the minty touches, and then of course maybe very, very faint rosy touches, very, very faint, not a lot at all in fact with this one, but I get spices, I get a little bit of cinnamon, perhaps some cloves in here, so it's almost like the warm holiday spices, maybe a little cardamom, no cumin, but in the end, what a great flanker this is. This is a flanker to the original Equipage, but it's just called Equipage Geranium, a fantastic fragrance. If you don't know this one, do check it out. Probably one of my favorite Hermes fragrances because I love the way it smells. So that's Equipage Geranium from the House of Hermes. And my favorite geranium fragrance happens to be from the House of Diptyque, and it's called Geranium Odorata. What a great fragrance this is. This is an absolute gem of a fragrance from Diptyque, focusing on geranium, and I don't think I had this fragrance when I did my top 20 geranium, not top 20, but I don't think I had this fragrance when I did my top 20 Diptyque fragrances video. I got it afterwards, and I'm obsessed with it. Even though I knew about this one, I just didn't have it in my collection. But what I like about this one is lots of geranium, so it's the kind of geranium that does have the rosiness. Definitely get roses. When I smell it out of the bottle, there's some light rosy touches in there. And then of course, it's minty. It's definitely a kind of a minty pepper. It's a kind of mint that's not mint that smells like mint. I don't know if that's making sense to you guys, but that's what I get with geranium. There's a minty undertone, which to me kind of smells like it, but then it's not. Lots of geranium, bergamot, vetiver here is as well. Pink pepper, cedar, tonka. I love it. I really, really love it. This one's a unisex offering, and I think that since it has a little bit of more of a floral touch, like a rosy floral touch, I think it's definitely something that women can totally pull off. Again, there's no gender with fragrances, but I feel like geranium in general is a masculine note. They're in masculine fragrances, but again, if you like what you smell and you want to wear it, wear it. It doesn't really matter what you wear. It's just, I personally think that geranium kind of leans a little masculine. But either way, Geranium Odorata, my favorite geranium fragrance from the house of Diptyque. And those are my selections of geranium focused fragrances. Let me know if you're fans of these particular fragrances, and in general, are you a fan of geranium and fragrances? If you do own any of these, or you have another favorite geranium fragrance, please do let me know, because it's, as I said, I had a hard time finding a lot of geranium focused fragrances, and most of them were from unknown brands or brands I didn't hear about or have no access to. So if I'm missing something, if you have a favorite geranium fragrance, do let me know. Put a comment down so I can find out. Anyway guys, thanks so much for watching today's very long video on geranium and geranium fragrances. If you have any questions or comments, please list below. Otherwise, please like this video, please share it, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I'll be back with more videos very soon. Have a good one. Goodbye.